Okay, everybody. Let's see. I know we started the information processing, I guess a week and a half ago now, but we're gonna just go through those first couple slides again as we go through. This week will be information processing and decision making primarily. Okay, so a couple things. One of the things I noticed is on Slack, um, hasn't been as much, I would say, directed discussion along the kind of questions that I'm posing every week. There's still some, but definitely want to kind of, I guess, spur that on. I'm not usually a fan of rigid deadlines like this, but I think it'll help clear things up. I mean, we're all busy and uh, have lives outside of this, but um, the this presentation will end with a question, and at least your initial posts, let's try to get those in by Monday night, and then we'll take next week to kind of discuss those. There will also, fingers crossed, be another lecture going up early next week, Sunday or Monday, on where we're at the next parts. We got a little behind. Sorry again about this week. It was a strange week here in the house, and but shouldn't happen again. But in order to catch up, I took a look at the syllabus. This week is actually supposed to be tools and practices, and then next week was going to be evaluations, I believe, or something along those lines. We're just going to cover both those in one lecture. I think we can do it. It might be a little fast, so feel free to ask questions if you need clarification. And we'll hopefully get back on track there. Let me see. I'm looking through the Slack now. Shirley, I love those comments, and it's interesting to look at kind of how where you might have taken things from, especially from past courses. That's neat. Um, Going into the design question I posted, so I saw this on Twitter where they removed the bus benches or bus subway benches. Um, so Nathan made a point about the redundancy. That's definitely true. Um, Very not ADA compliant, he noted there. And I posted a stat I pulled that in 2017, the New York City subway uh, had 5.6 million daily riders on weekdays. So try to consider when you're responding to some of these things, the scale of some of these designs that you have to do. Um, let's see, Jerry commented about the purpose. Yes, the goal is to move as many bodies as possible and have not people not wait too long. That's definitely true. That would be in a situation where we're trying to maximize the efficiency of the system or of those things. But uh, it is, I think it was noted further down, I'm sure I'll see it, about public transit's notoriously not on time. And as working in logistics and transportation before, I can tell you that nothing related to transportation ever runs on time in a way that's predictable and something you can count on. So and also there are those disability type considerations. One thing to keep in mind throughout our design questions or your projects is in some other courses with different focuses, we'd be looking at those things, how to maximize this system for maximizing profit or maximizing efficiency or those things. Those have a relevance here, but for this course, and particularly where we're talking about nuclear power and the nuclear industry in general, our focus is more on the humans. So we want to make sure we're looking at like the ADA type concerns. Um, so yeah, Shirley mentioned, we're tweaking the benches. Luke also had that conversation. But let's see. Let's see. I'm just going through. Sorry. Mary brought up the visual detection problems with those, with the lines on the ground. And yeah, that also shows there are problems with distance vision as well. But yeah, getting on this there, I didn't want us to focus too much about the relevant social implications or policy implications. That's a its own problem. But to look at, you know, making sure that you can design a system that works for the maximum number of users. So that's where, you know, you have to take into consideration people with disabilities or even just differently able individuals. If I can remember, I'll try to post, and if you're interested, remind me if I forget. But I can post a link to a video from a psychologist in England. He was actually a basketball player too. His name's John Amaechi. And he has a bit about privilege. It's, I don't know, it's a few minutes, which is really important to keep in mind as we design things. He essentially argues that privilege is not necessarily a benefit that's something unique or something you're aware of. He makes the case, you know, everybody has some privilege of something. Everybody has those things, and essentially what it is the absence of inconvenience. And often, if there's something that you haven't noticed, I know if you've ever been in a course and somebody presents a topic or says something and you think, wow, I've never really thought about it that way. That shows a privileged view. You see the world in a way that shows that off. So one of the things our job is as designers is to divorce ourselves from our own privilege and to constantly consider things in from other perspectives. There's we'll get into it when we get into more of the design things, but there's a thing called the false consensus effect. So cognitively, we have a ton of weird biases and failures. We'll get into some of them today. But one of the things to keep in mind is we tend to overestimate how many people share our ideas, how many people think that we're doing that what we're doing or what we think is accurate or right or those things. So that's why we try to always make sure that when we design something, we are not explicitly not assuming that we are the user or, well, I can use this or I can do this thing. I think it would work. That first person perspective has no place really in design. So keep that in there. Shirley talking about mental shortcuts and autopilot. That is a big problem in nuclear, especially anything where you have long stretches of time with not a lot happening. So high vigilance tasks. Humans are really bad about that. Talk a little bit about working memory span and executive control. That's the problem. Things in nuclear don't tend to happen very fast. So working memory really that's not something that you're going to be relying on very much, except for in immediate instances. So it's heavily in executive control and in procedure, following proceduralization and those kind of things. Yep, I love the Florida water treatment thing. That's hilarious. Honestly, I'm shocked they caught it. There's enough story. There's enough interesting points about Florida as just, I don't know, an area of reality that is that just made me kind of surprised that they caught it. But I'm also, though, while that was great that they caught it, we weren't there, we don't know, but at least immediately, I want to know what immediate notifications did that operator make? Did he, when he saw something weird, did he immediately start, engaging with supervisors or emergency service people or different teams at his facility, or did he just sit there and watch it and try to figure it out? That's a big thing that has been mostly, I think, beaten or bred out of nuclear in general is the idea that you can solve everything yourself. Also, because nuclear was born out of the military and out of some of the teaming aspects of the military, team like TEAM there, not any other aspects that may be teaming within the military, but it's something to keep in mind. That is a problem. We don't ever want any single point failures. We don't want any one person trying to be a hero or take things on themselves. That's just not the way. That's not the way that nuclear wants to function or have its safety culture just be. So keep that in mind. And yeah, just try to keep engaging. It seems like this last week we were probably all a little busy, but you know, a lot of comments on the homeless bench thing, but try to keep engaged, re-engage, you know, if it's possible, you know, try to check it once a day, once every couple of days, and just make a comment, even if it's just, yeah, that's a good point or something. So just try to keep that in mind. Okay, so let's see, we'll go into the information processing stuff now. So I know we already talked a little bit about this. So encoding in memory is like you're entering in information. Storage is saving it to a folder or a drive on your computer, and retrievals when you navigate to it in your file explorer and open it. That's a really clean way to kind of understand how it works. And then it also gives you a way to frame where errors might be. Human information processor. Okay, I know we talked about this a little bit. There's a ton of really interesting information on experiments that were done back in the time that this idea was kind of in vogue, where a lot of our understanding of memory encoding times, decay timing, and a lot of that came from these research areas. Sensory memory, this is a big one in nuclear. You know, we talked about how auditory cues aren't really their main thing. They start to memorize patterns of lights. That is 100% a rehearsed sensory memory that was stored in long term. There's a lot of those just in our daily life when we try to understand that. And like those times down there, keep in mind that they are very short. I mean, short relatively to like our perception. Those are actually relatively long compared to cognitive processing. And yeah, the short-term store. So this is if you are trying to hold something in your mind for a brief period of time. 7 plus or minus, that's 7 plus or minus 2 usually. So we can hold 5 to 9 chunks of information. What defines a chunk is kind of muddy somewhat, but you can think of it like when you're trying to remember, there's a reason phone numbers are 7 digits. They were, and zip codes are 5. They're easy ways, they're easy snippets of numbers to remember. So just kind of keep that in mind. Also, but another thing also to think about, I remember when I was learning Spanish and some of my friends in school that were Hispanic, I would notice sometimes they would give me their phone number and they would give the doubles to me. So instead of like 520, like that, they would say 520. So 20 is a distinct number. So that might be a mental shortcut there to save chunks so that you can use 20 in one chunk instead of 2 and then a 0. So sometimes those shortcuts can be helpful. Short-term, also this is the working memory. This is, yeah, we talked about some of this, the phonological loop, episodic buffer, and visuospatial sketchpad. And then they interact with the central executive. We'll get into those soon. Or immediately, you remember where it was. So the visuospatial sketchpad, they call it that because consider it essentially a sketchpad. You have the where and the what. So when you are remembering details of a scene or an image, you are remembering relative positions and features or components of an object. Those are specifically saved unique from others. So that is why we talked about this in a previous week where our brain then has to recombine pieces of information when they're asked for. We don't, it's generally understood that we don't have a, let's say we don't have a a memory chunk that is specifically an elephant. We instead have memory chunks that are components of characteristics of an elephant. And those are then reassembled when we call up the idea of an elephant. And yes, so they're independent of phonological loop and episodic buffer. Episodic buffer is kind of not totally independent of anything. It has its fingers everywhere, but the phonological loop it is. The current belief is that our auditory and visual memory systems and processing systems are distinct. So phonological loop, this is your verbal auditory store. So we have the storage and the rehearsal. So this is when you talk to yourself in your head, internal monologues, when we can actively hear a thing, and let's say you hear something and the sentence doesn't totally make sense. You get the meaning, but the words don't necessarily make sense. Your brain may be manipulating those words into something that better aligns with what schemas you have. Some of the characteristics, articulatory suppression is a big one. I don't know if you've ever experienced this where you'll be talking and somebody's trying to ask you a question, or somehow you're trying to interfere with your memory, or interface, not interfere, interface with your memory. That is pretty tricky, but what will happen is you generally will stop talking. And likewise, if you're listening, you will stop listening. Phonological and semantic similarity are some of my favorite memory things. So words that sound similar are more difficult to remember, rather than if they are similar in meaning. So if you're trying to remember door and pour, you will have a harder time than, let's say, I'm trying to think of a good example that lines up with that analogy. So let's say you were trying to remember poor and impoverished, for example. You could remember, but there would be little interference in that kind of a memory situation. The capacity, yeah, so you're going to decay in about 2 seconds with that. Episodic buffer. So this is how we start to build what we'll get into shortly, schemas. This is what orders our memories. If you're assembling the pieces, this is what makes sure that the pieces you assemble come together in the right order so that you get the right memory. It specifically binds those informations into units called episodes. It's really useful for rules or common social procedures or any kind of procedure we have to go through. So for nuclear, episodic buffers are very important because over time, the memories of these procedures that maybe they do regularly will be ingrained. And so you'll get some automaticity out of that has its pros and cons. It's limited capacity, it's passive, it's not usually something you can engage with consciously. And it can create the memory trace. So that's something, I don't know if I do this all the time, where I will forget what I was doing and I will try to walk back through my memory of the past minute or 5 minutes or whatever. That's why I can do that. Subcentral executive, this is the seat of consciousness. This is where I think Shirley had asked about working memory in that nuclear. Central executive is the big one in nuclear versus working memory. So we're looking at, it is coordinating the information across the episodic buffer, sketchpad, and loop to build the memory structures and schemas that it needs to execute a task. You will have different strategies that you can undertake depending on what the specific goal is at the moment. And then this is how we can do selective attention, various conscious inhibition, if we're trying to dull down a section of our brain or memories or attention to access another part, those kind of things. Long-term memory. So after rehearsal, you can get things into long-term memory. So indefinitely, that has a star on it. So technically, the current assumption is that we can and do store every second of every minute of our life. The problem's in retrieval. It's not in, we're not running out of hard drive space. It's just trying to find that. So semantic networks and schemas, this is how the brain kind of shatters scenes or specific memories we have into their components to better allow for fast retrieval and assimilation of different memory structures. You have declarative and non-declarative memory, or two specific areas or types of memory that we use in there. And yeah, encoding, forgetting, retrieval. So forgetting always to me is almost like a reverse of rehearsal. Not explicitly one-to-one, but that's just kind of how it has always made sense to me. This is an example of a semantic network. So it's essentially, in schemas are similar. You'll hear, oh, I don't remember it specifically. I want to say cognitive clouding, but I don't think that's right. But essentially a memory cloud or an association of connections that we can walk through to collect information from our memory about whatever we're faced with in the real world. So it's hierarchical. Usually you'll see, general to specific as you go down. And the strength of relationships will differ, but will also increase your retrieval speed. If you have and think about that as like a neuroplasticity thing. So if you've walked that path a lot in your mind, it will be faster to get there. That is also why we see some cognitive biases that we'll get into shortly. And it is very efficient. It's used in a lot of computational things too, because it tends to work as a way to store and kind of highlight information that some algorithm or model needs to interact with. Schemas are, a mental framework for organizing knowledge. This is going to be more abstract and task oriented. This is more situational than a semantic network. When you walk into a restaurant, like the picture here, you're not walking down a semantic network to try to understand all the features of your environment, because there are procedural steps that need to come into play there, which are outside of a semantic network. So this is how we're looking at scripts and different slots where you might store specific information, necessary tasks, and expectations. That's how we can interface with many different types of restaurants, and they all tend to, our interaction with that environment is relatively similar. But the first time you go to, like, say, a hibachi place, that might be a bit jarring that first time as you're building schemas and scripts for that situation. Declarative and non-declarative, essentially declarative memory is factual information. So this is, memorizing a map like shown here, or 2 + 2 = 4, or, in this nuclear system, this turbo control system, you have the turbine is connected to X, Y, and Z in this order. Where a non-declarative system is more our, gut feelings. It's the information between the lines there. Some examples are listed out here in terms of emotions, reflexes, and motor skills like that. I like this reference because of the reference to driving, especially if you've had a car for a significant amount of time. You will start to understand the feel of it and know when something's wrong. Nuclear power plants, actually, there's a similarity there. I've seen senior operators be able to see a simulation and say something seems wrong because it's just not responding the way that they expect it to, the way they've seen it to. That's less of a perceptual motor skills, like from what we think tactile, like the feel of tires on pavement and that. It's more just those visual memories and that. So definitely both are very important, however. Semantic memory versus episodic memory. So Semantic lives in declarative. This is going to be, general knowledge. George Washington's first president is kind of the textbook example there. Where your episodic memory system is the one that gives you kind of more deep recollections of situations you've been experienced, First kiss is a big one. Where were you at on 9/11? Those kind of things. Those memories are episodic, and also keep in mind though, anything that's coming from your memory directly is subjective. So we talk about flashbulb memory. Sometimes that's an immediate image response of something that you can recall that you saw. But another interesting thing to think about is a condition called aphantasia. It's really, really neat if you get into it and want to research it. It's essentially the inability to imagine things visually in your memory or in your imagination, I guess. And I haven't ever explored if aphantasia affects flashbulb memories, so if they still can't remember imagery that way. But, if it's kind of so, we're doing some remodeling around the house. So I will imagine this is what this project's going to do to this room, and I can visualize it. And when I say visualize it, I literally mean I can see a picture of it. There are people that cannot do that. And that's an interesting phenomenon there to keep in mind. There's a lot of this, if we're going to be doing design that's human-centered, understanding and making sure design works for everybody, including these kind of strange I guess it's strange if you do it the other way, but to them it's not. It's what they've always done. So encoding. So a lot of this we all have experience with. So the way you get memories from short-term to long-term is encoding and rehearsal. So when we start adding associations, we start breaking them up, building semantic coding, visual coding, different characteristics we're coding into memory. That way, when you think about it from a semantic network, you're building up those arrows and making that path more well-trod. Mnemonics is a big one because, again, you're trying to remember the steps you took to get to a place or various things like that. The Memory Palace works really good with that. It relies heavily on visual memory that is really strong and easy to generate for most people. Chunking, so breaking pieces of information into subparts and then memorizing those. The spacing effect, so distributed practice is more effective than massing all your practice at once. Maybe it's crammed, knows that. Cramming is not an efficient way to encode memory when you're cramming for a test or something. Doesn't mean it doesn't work sometimes, but it is just not the most efficient for good building robust memories for your long term. Forgetting. So why do we forget? It's definitely an adaptive process. So this example about where you parked your car. So it's not important where you parked your car yesterday. It's immediately important where you parked it today. So your brain kind of defrags or deletes things that it hasn't used in a while. Prioritization is another key part of that. If there's a situation you go through 100 situations and let's say 10 of them had one type of characteristic and the other 90 had a different one, you'll probably forget the 10. But if that's flipped, you have the other one has a higher priority because if something continually happens to you, we're designed from an evolutionary perspective to remember things that we might need in the future. And if our world always happens in a certain way, that's very relevant to us. Ineffective encoding is forgetting, which is interesting because we tend to think of forgetting as something gets to our memory and then it drifts away. Not always, sometimes it just doesn't get there. Decay interference is another big one where things might interfere with your memory retrieval, which is the last one, retrieval failure. Again, doesn't mean you forgot it technically. The file might still be there, you just maybe can't find it. Forgetting with interference. So this is an issue because the recall of words interferes with recalls of other words. This is another issue one that if you want to dig into the research on or even do your own research on, it's kind of a neat, they're probably pretty tricky experiments to operationalize, but they seem really interesting to me. So newly acquired material will impede the recall of older material. Why? Like we talked about with the parking spot, recency is important. Our brains are kind of designed to remember things that happened recently. It's just assumed that that's more important. That's one form of it. The other one, proactive. So things that are learned in the past impedes the learning of new material. So this is when you have that has Ron and Roger. This is if you have a name that, let's say you learned a long time ago, you've dealt with that person a lot, you might call somebody with a similar name the previous name just because, again, that strength of that relationship in your mind is a lot stronger, a lot greater. I guess the strength would be greater if it's stronger. Yeah. So then you can, it'll interfere as you're trying to acquire the new memory. That's definitely something that you need to be able to manage and be aware of too. This is a lot of these things, and I'll try to mention this more throughout, when we're talking about these sensory things, when we get into specifics in nuclear, or if you have specifics in nuclear you want to talk about, or process control, any complex system design, these are the things that people don't always think about, but they need to, because often the line between human error or not, or success, I guess, is very fine. And so sometimes having a design that helps in these ways can make the difference. Retrieval, so recall versus recognition. This is something you will hear a lot. Well, I guess the inverse of it when we get to human computer interaction, which is recognition over recall. So this is where instead of forcing people to remember something, you either show it to them again if they need to. In a nuclear example, think, okay, I have to monitor this process of value. So, but instead of making the operator remember it, you're just going to build it into your display. Maybe he can pin it, or he can save it in a place so that he can always have it there. Or hints, different ways to signpost what that memory was can help speed up that recall and make it more accurate. So keep that in mind. Context cues are also huge because just like in that semantic network, the more the strength of the link and how often that path is walked is really, really important. But and it's not like having more characteristics about the context in that semantic network helps necessarily. It's just more when you come into another context that has those characteristics, there's just more opportunities for that memory to fire. Is the way to think about that. Fallibility. So memory, while extremely powerful, we can save every minute of our lives and all those things. It is really not very reliable. Remember, most of our cognitive abilities are designed for immediate survival in a jungle type setting, not what we use them for often. So we tend to fill in parts of our memory based off of past experience and expectations. That's true. Say you walk into a situation and it serves a schema that is 70% complete, your brain will fill it in, and not always with what we would think makes the most sense. So we have to keep that in mind. Our memories will fit schemas first versus the other way around. Misattribution is failing to remember where something was seen or heard. So this is source monitoring error. So you remember the thing or the incident occurring, you just don't remember those kind of sensory type information or its source or genesis. Misinformation or suggestibility. So misleading post-event information alters retrieval. Eyewitness testimony question framing. So how you ask questions, maybe with kids knows this. leading questions. I can lead my kids into remembering all sorts of stuff. And often our memory tends to assume that, yeah, sure, that's totally a memory versus being a little bit more skeptical. There's a famous experiment. Um, Probably one of the people who in the class who's been in psych longer than I have might remember the details, or I can look it up and maybe even post it. But it was the kids getting lost in the mall experiment. So a bunch of psychologists essentially fed memories to children about getting lost in a mall or a department store, and then would ask them, in a separate instance, would ask them if they had ever been lost, and they would always say yes, I was. And they'd have these really like deep memories, these very sensory focused. I was wearing this. I remember this sound and all these things. Um, but they weren't fed all that detailed information. They were just fed kind of general concepts. So they filled in the rest. Because again, if you're lost in the mall, if someone tells you, yes, remember you were lost in the mall, your schema is going to start to fill in what you know about a mall, what you know about the sounds and those characteristics. And so to fill in the memory. That is a problem because now I don't know if you could do that nowadays with IRVs and ethics of research, um, but that's a big problem if our memory is that malleable. So they all profoundly have these deep memories that never happened, and that's an interesting thing to consider when we think about eyewitness testimony is the big one, but what about an incident occurs at a power plant and we need to figure out what happened? Um, their memory, anybody who's involved, their memory is not precise and is not remembering specifics. Again, our memory does not remember specifics. It's trying to remember what it thinks is important. And then it's also going to be changing constantly based off of additional information. So that's definitely a thing to keep in mind there, and to try to, how do we handle that in design? How do we build in ways to maximize, let's say, the logging of information, so we have a way to go back to it if we need to. So now we'll go into decision making. This is kind of a more interesting area for me, at least. So decision making is evaluating options and making a choice, and then taking an action, usually. So the adaptive decision maker framework, this is the steps that we go into. Sometimes it's that, sometimes there's others there. That just tends to change depending on what we're doing there. Let's see here. Oh, it's not skipping. There we go. Okay. Oh, sorry about that, guys. My computer seems to be wanting to freeze up for a second. Pause this, hold on. Okay, sorry about that. Hopefully this will work a little bit better now. Okay, so classical decision theory, when you go back to what we think about decision making, this mainly goes back to economics and statisticians to start with. Game theory is another area of decision theory that you may have heard of. So economic man and woman, this is kind of the foundational underpinnings for, I would say, even still to this day, modern economics. Decision makers are assumed to be fully informed, infinitely sensitive, and have full rationale. That means they are purely rational and make decisions based off of a rational framework. One of the biggest problems I have with classical decision theory, I've ran into this actually in every economics class I took too. I was almost an economics major actually. In general, it doesn't really square with what we know about human cognition. Humans are never fully informed. They are not sensitive in most instances, and rational isn't generally something I would apply to them. we often make decisions counter to our rational thought or what might benefit us. Oh my gosh, is it not working again? There we go. So psychological decision theory, this is something behavioral economics has started to take some strides in this. Behavioral economics is also what I call when economists discovered psychology. They just created a new one instead of just realizing psychology could do it itself. So decision making under risk. So under uncertainty is the big one, because we're assuming that there are deficits in our decision making capabilities. So how do we make decisions given that? Subjective expected utility. So we're looking at essentially a cognitive calculus of potential utility or benefit, as well as probabilities. Problems there, we are not traditionally very good at probability. We're also not very good at assessing utility, but we're closer than we were before. It's based on bounded rationality, so rational without limits or within limits. This is can be traced back to Simon 1947, or if you really want to go old school, this can trace back to Descartes' theory of cognition and metaphysics. So essentially, when we go outside of our bounds is when we are at risk for errors, is the thought there. Predictably Irrational, if you haven't read it, it is fantastic. I love everything from Dan Ariely, personally. And it goes into essentially areas, I guess, where we are rational, characteristics of situations that may encourage irrationality. And that's a really, really interesting book. Some other decision-making strategies. So lexicographic. So it's essentially we're ranking which one has the best value on the most important characteristic. Choosing the first one that is satisfactory. That is actually a very common one, I think, especially when time pressure ends up being a problem. Elimination. So some arbitrary cutoff given based on attribute or a specific end goal, let's say. You eliminate ones you cannot see how they would achieve it. Group decision making, so consensus. Anybody who's ever been on a committee or a board knows that they, of course, make the best decisions ever. Sarcasm heavily implied there. Naturalistic decision making. This is one I tend to like a little bit more. It's also one that's a little bit more prominent in the nuclear field. So recognition prime decision making. It's essentially, okay, if we recognize a situation, it automatically jumps up our list on as a possible alternative or path. It's essentially a blend of satisficing and mental simulation. So then some other methods, trial and error. That was pretty straightforward, right? Try it till it works. Algorithmic. It guarantees a solution, but not necessarily an optimal solution. Kind of depends on what your priorities are and what the goal there is. Heuristics. This is what I would say the most common way people tend to make decisions are by heuristics. These are rule of thumb, guiding principles, and their heuristic is a mental shortcut kind of by definition. So we're using them because they make us be able to make decisions faster or with less information. Can be applied across a large variety of situations with generally, I'd say, reasonable success. However, the last point there is important for us as designers. It can contain biases. Now, this is one specific thing to think about too. These decision-making processes, be aware of them in yourself. When we say they contain biases, you as a designer will use heuristics that contain biases. Every biased algorithm in the world was designed by somebody who had biases in themselves that made their way into their designs. So one of the points of this class is hopefully you can get to the end with the ability to design something with some reasonable level of separation from yourself. That's an important characteristic, I think, for any designer. The Linda problem. So this illustrates the conjunctive fallacy. So you can read this here. Essentially, the idea is that you have somebody read this and then you give them some various options and see which ones people choose or believe that the likelihood is more true or not. Leave it on this slide for a second so you guys can read it. And obviously, I guess since this is a video, you can pause it, but either way there. So Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. That is true and false. That is usually the most likely one that you will get. The second one is the next most common, which is totally false. And the last one is true. So an interesting thing to keep in mind is people will tend to, they'll trend to something that's more specific. We tend to like to attribute characteristics that we that are not actually there. So for example, bookstore, yoga classes, active in the feminist movement, all those things are often projections of what we think, okay, a person with this characteristic, with this prompt, may have some of these other characteristics, even though there is no reference to any of those in the specific trend there or in the specific prompt. And that's a problem that we see a lot. And the biggest issue with it, and again, that's why I said we're not really good at probability. Joint probability, so the probability of two things simultaneously, is never equal to the probability of one of those things on its own, just due to the mathematics of that all. So we see the conjunctive or conjunction fallacy, and that is due to the representativeness heuristic. So making judgments about the probability of an event under uncertainty, or judging a situation based on how similar the prospects are to the prototypes the person holds in his or her mind. This is when we make judgments about people based off of limited information and those kind of things. We try to create a whole picture from a partial view. Availability, this is a big one too. Judgments about the probability of events by the ease with which examples come to mind. So what I was saying is if you've experienced a situation frequently, or that memory path is well trod, it will be more available. So then we are more likely to use that as a way to make a decision. Anchoring and adjustment, you rely more heavily on the first piece of information that you get, that becomes your anchor, and then you adjust all subsequent pieces of information given the context of that anchor. Escalation of commitment, continued investment in decision based on the cumulative prior investment. So this is the sunk cost fallacy. So, but I really probably think this is wrong, but I've already spent a bunch of effort into trying to figure it out or proving it was right in the first place or whatever. So I have to keep going, or I wasted all that effort. That's not the way that tends to work. You can't get any of that effort or time back. You can only waste additional. So it's kind of already spent, is the way to think about that. Sunk cost fallacy is a huge problem in, I would say, most large organizational structures as well. Contagion heuristic, this is a big one this year with COVID, right? Avoid association with others that are viewed as contaminated. This just doesn't just have to be like an illness. Contaminated with a thought we dislike, a political view, or every engineer I've ever met has X characteristics, so you just tend to apply it and then make decisions based off of that. Naive diversification, so you will tend to Diversify your decisions more than is necessary. Effort. So the worth of something is determined by the amount of effort taken to get it. You know, you worked really hard, so therefore that end result of that work has more value than something that didn't take as much work. So framing, again, framing is a huge problem. And it's all of these, as you're seeing, are characteristics of our own subjective, or it's our projections of subjective views onto something in the world. So if somebody, this is sales 101, right? You can influence somebody's decision based on how you frame the information you're giving them. Some problem solving strategies. These are, we're getting more into the aspects of nuclear that you'll see. Nuclear is a serious undertaking, very serious industry filled with professionals. You'll hear a lot of this of, you know, let's find the solution, you know, don't point fingers, kind of those characteristics. So the structure of problems or a choice, if we're looking at decision making, framing, still a problem, can change the difficulty to find a solution. If you have a well-structured problem, then there tends to be a clear path towards a solution. Ill-structured and isomorphic can have separate issues. Ill-structured is, in my opinion, the most common one you'll see in life. Well-structured is the most common one you'll see in most nuclear incidents. Nuclear has been around a long time. They've simulated a lot of different things. There's procedures for everything. But you also never know when a freak incident's going to happen. So it's important to design and understand both. Problem solving strategies specifically. So problem solving by analogy. I solved this problem and it was similar to this one in 70% of the characteristics. So let's try the same solution. Or you try to fit either problems to your new solution, to the solution that worked before, or your solution to the problem. But it all is grounded on an analogous incident. Incubation is another one that is actually tends to be relatively successful. Our brains do well when faced with novel stimulus. It doesn't take very long to get the novelty back. If you've ever experienced that, where you might be stuck on a situation, this happens a lot like programming or writing and stuff. You're stuck on something, so you go off, do something else, and then you can come back and pick it right up and get to your goal a lot quicker. Forming sub-goals is also extremely effective. This is one thing you'll see in nuclear a lot. You will have a procedure that might be 40 pages. That is just a procedure of sub-goals. You will have some things you have to do, and in aggregate, you will get to the end goal of the procedure. This Tower Fenoy problem is a common experimental test that we do to assess some of these characteristics there. So changing the problem representation. So this is one of my favorite kind of, the first time I heard this was presented like a riddle. But okay, how do you solve it? Most people would either, at least when I did this before, I would list out the steps and try to prove okay, well, how can I prove that he will pass the same place? Some other people would do mathematically. So try to build an equation to do it. And in general, both those work relatively poorly. However, if you frame the problem's representation in the form of a graph, you can always see that they will prove that no matter what those relative speeds are and where it said the variety of speeds and stop points, there will always be one spot along those charts where you can see that commonality. So barriers to making decisions and problem solving accurately. Negative positive transfer. This is similar to the interference problems we were talking about. solving an earlier problem makes it harder to solve a later one, because cognitively the earlier problem's circumstance and memory is more available. So it's hard to break out of, even subconsciously, that decision making path. Functional fixedness or fixatedness, the tendency to perceive an item only in terms of its most common use. Think outside the box is a response to this there. Um, Persist to use past problem strategies. So, when you're stuck only on what worked before and you're not being able to solve the problem at hand or see what some novel solutions might be present. Assuming unnecessary constraints. This is another one of the ways that psychology grad students will torture undergrads is some of these experiments. So you have to connect all points with 4 straight lines without moving the pen from the paper. Did I bring that one up? Nope. Okay. So when we're looking at this, if you Google this, you'll find some different solutions. The answer is involves some diagonals, and that the point that comes across there is people will tend to assume that you can't cross your lines. We see that in some other mental challenges or puzzles. Oh yeah, draw this, but you can't cross the line. This is something that we do as people almost always subconsciously in every area of our life. We assume constraints, we assume that we can't do something without any information or instruction that affirms that. So that's one thing that'll happen. Oh no, you can't turn there. Why not? And asking those questions. So it's an important thing to be aware of. So if you experience it, you can break out of it. And here's our last slide for this section. So we have biases, heuristics, memory limitations, and error traps, and all of our tasking, right? So as a designer, we have to, as best as we can, account for biases and heuristics present in our population, also present in just humanity in general. If the task we're presenting is one that we can see how maybe there's common analogies or those things that somebody might go into, we want to be aware of that. We want to ensure that you're designing for cognitive capabilities. So this goes back the past couple of weeks. You want to design in a way that doesn't rely, for example, on certain colors if people might be colorblind, or certain auditory cues with full knowledge now of how our auditory system works. You don't want to present a situation that's problematic out of the gate. And as we've been going into cognitive things, that's the thing that I see the most often in nuclear is things are designed in a way that are just incompatible with human cognition. They're making assumptions that people will do things that we don't do naturally. Doesn't mean we can't do them. They usually just have to be trained or proceduralized into us. But wouldn't it just be easier if we just designed it to accommodate that to start with? That's a big one. And then error traps. You'll never spot all of them. You can't design them all away. And honestly, user exposure to your situation is probably the only way you're going to see them, because as a designer, you will fundamentally know the right path through the maze. So because you know the right answer, it makes it very, very hard to see the wrong. That's where users come in handy to help you find those things. And yeah, the majority of them you can find, the better. So how can a design help solve these? So in the Slack, propose a problem and a solution. So we'll do this by Monday night. So what is a potential issue that you see what's a design that can solve these issues in, we don't have anybody, I think, with a lot of experience in nuclear process control. So we'll avoid that. We might ask this question again in a later lecture after you guys have had some exposure to that. But let's see, let's try to take into consideration just a common task. What's a common task that you've seen the biases, heuristics, or some of these things are at play, and it makes human error more likely. Now, assume you could redesign that from scratch. Doesn't have to be anything extremely complicated. What would be some changes that you would make to the design to avoid the biases and heuristics that you see now? And then also propose that as a solution, and just kind of discuss how could you have seen those before the design rolled out? What are some of the steps there? So I gave you one, right? You find a bunch of error traps in a task, user testing of that task probably would have found a lot of those. But how could we as designers best protect our process from these as well? So think about those. Again, sorry for the delay. There'll probably be another lecture up next week and stuff, and we'll just try. So next week might have, I guess, a little bit more in terms of Slack discussions, just to get us caught up. And remember, ask questions. A lot of you have been pretty good about that, asking questions of just different ideas and thoughts on the Slack. If any of these don't make sense, ask them. Aside from me, we've got a lot of good diverse opinions in the group, so we might have some good conversations come of that. So, all right, I hope you guys have a good weekend or week whenever you're watching this, and I'll talk to you later.